Okay. Am I on? Okay, hi. I'm Carolyn. I'm with the Academy of Science. We're very pleased to be partners with the St. Louis Zoo to bring you the Conservation Conversations, generously underwritten by Cooper Busman. Many of you who are Academy members and friends, you already are very familiar with the Academy, but just to give some background on who we are, the Academy is an independent science organization supported entirely through community contributions. We have been connecting science and the community since 1856 and have a long-standing mission to advance the public understanding of science and inspire the next generation of scientists and science advocates. We offer a broad range of free and low-cost public science programming, collaborative science seminars, and trips and tours highlighting science at venues throughout the region. You can find out more information on our website at www.academyofsciencestl.org. You may also visit us on Facebook or Twitter, or pick up some of our literature that is on the table out in the lobby. If you'd like to receive e-notification of upcoming Academy and St. Louis Zoo public lectures and events, there's an e-news sign-up sheet on the table in the lobby, and then I will also pass a couple out. If you are a student who needs to verify your attendance, and I know there's a couple of you out there, just come see me after the event. I do want to mention an event that is going to be coming up this week. The Academy has partnered with the Explorers Club of St. Louis, the Missouri History Museum, and the Archaeological Institute of America St. Louis Society on a special event at the History Museum's atrium. This will take place Wednesday night at 7:30. Anthropologist and bioarchaeologist Dr. Jane Volkstra with Arizona State University will discuss mummification and related practices in ancient South America. The talk is free and open to the public. You do not need to register to attend. And with that, I'm going to introduce Stephanie from the zoo.
Hello, I'm Stephanie Braccini, Zoological Manager of Great Apes here at the St. Louis Zoo. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm going to take just a quick moment and go over some of the upcoming events that may be of interest to you, all of which are taking place in the Anheuser-Busch Theater where you are right now. On Thursday, October 18th, we have a special lunchtime lecture titled Action for Cheetahs in Kenya. Mary Wickstra, director, and lots of words I can't pronounce. Cosmas Wambua, Louise, am I close? Okay. Senior Scientist of Action for Cheetahs in Kenya. On Tuesday, October 23rd, we have another conservation conversation, tracking turtles from the volcanoes of Galapagos to Tyson and downtown St. Louis by Dr. Stephen Blake. And on Tuesday, November 20th, the unique conservation challenges of saving the vulnerable desert Humboldt penguin in Puta San Juan, presented by our own Mike Masek. Also a little closer to my heart, on October 26th, from 6 to 9 at Craft Alliance, we're having our Primate Picasso's art auction, or art show, sorry, where we will have primate painted apes. We're not painting the apes. Promise. Ape painted artwork for sale, as well as some ornaments and bookmarks. And it's just a fun event to come out and see what our great apes do. Without further ado, I have a quick little introduction of Dr. Crickette Sanz and Dr. David Morgan. I first met them in 2007 at the Chimpanzee Mind Conference as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed graduate student who strolled up and made sure that they were measuring handedness, as all proper scientists should do in the field, which they were not. Dave has always been someone that's kind of neat to talk to. He always wanted to work with chimps, was always very passionate about behavior and applied conservation, and first went out to Mbelibai in 1996 before establishing his own field site, which you're going to hear about tonight. Crickette completed her Ph.D. here at WashU and then joined Dave in 2001, and they're just some of the most passionate people I've ever met when it comes to primate research and conservation of pretty much all species that they come in contact with. So as co-principal investigators of the Goualougo Triangle Ape Project, Crickette and Dave conduct multiple field studies to examine the behavioral ecology of chimpanzees, the social and ecological factors shaping these complex cool use traditions, and their complex relationships with each other, as well as interspecies with chimps and gorillas. So before I give away any of the key secrets of what they're going to talk about tonight, may I introduce Dr. Crickette Sanz and Dr. Dave Morgan.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you all for having us tonight. Crickette and I are very excited to be able to present some of our work and latest findings. And our talk entitled The Truth About Chimpanzees. Perhaps a good place to start is when we started this expedition. And when I first went out to these forests, there really wasn't much of a demand to study chimpanzees in Central Africa. In fact, many people said it's not worth it. We know all we should know about chimpanzees at this time. Jane Goodall's been studying them for over 40 years at that time. But for Crickette and I, Central Africa, the intact forests of the Ndoki, there's a lot to learn about them, and we hope we're able to convey some of that information to you tonight. These forests are very well known for the high abundance of western lowland gorillas and also central chimpanzees. And facts about these animals start to appear in the early 90s when ecologists started moving through Central Africa and studying these areas. And it was epitomized in 1995 by an article in National Geographic. It was titled Ndoki, the Last Place on Earth. And at that time, these forests were very intact, very remote. And as you could see from the photos of Nick Nichols, the NGS photographer, you could get very close to these apes because they didn't have much experience with humans. In this article, this magazine changed my mind. I was a young kid who'd grown up wanting to be around chimpanzees my whole life. And this photo here shows me along with my sister and a little doll that I had, a chimpanzee that I carried around. And I was very fortunate because my parents, they would take me to zoos, petting farms. I could read a lot about animals. And when I heard about that National Geographic article, that located the place that I wanted to work and where Crickette are probably going to spend the rest of our lives studying these animals. Now, many times when kids growing up and they want to dress up for Halloween, many kids want to be policemen or firemen. But I was so infatuated with apes and western lowland gorillas in particular. My mother was fortunate enough to design a costume for me in 1997 as a western lowland gorilla. And that just shows the passion that I had. Now, when I was growing up, I looked for people to strive to be. And somebody here, close to St. Louis, in the St. Louis Zoo, was Marlon Perkins. I know he worked at a zoo, and he would go to Africa. And some of the hallmarks of his work was getting out, getting close to the animals and studying them. And I followed that. When I was in high school and in college, I started working at a roadside zoo. And then I moved on to Busch Gardens and several other zoological parks, working in the education departments and with the great apes. So I got experience, kind of a different way than many other people had chosen. My big break came in 1996 when I went to Mbeli Bai to be a research assistant. And this was a unique place. Up until this point, we know very little about western lowland gorillas because they're very hard to habituate. This clearing, the gorillas would come out into the field, and you could sit up on this platform and you could observe them. They would easily habituate to our presence. And we saw spectacular displays, such as this silverback displaying at another silverback. So very quickly, we started learning about their behavior in a small forest clearing. And it was clear the Ndoki forests held a lot to tell us about great apes.
So I was a graduate student at Central Washington University, and I heard reports about a researcher that had gone out into Northern Republic of Congo and was studying the gorillas at the Mbeli Bai. But he'd also heard local folklore talk about chimpanzees that had never seen humans before, the naive chimpanzees of the Goualougo Triangle. And this was David Morgan, and he was hoping to establish a long-term study site there. At that time, as I mentioned, I was a graduate student at Central Washington University, and I met my first chimpanzees at the Chimpanzee and Human Communication Institute. These chimpanzees are very special. Washoe, who's pictured here on the right, is the first non-human to have acquired a human language. She'd acquired American Sign Language, being raised as a human child or in a human setting. Her foster parents had taught her sign language. I happened to have been raised next door to a little girl who was deaf, so I was fluent in sign language, and I thought, well, what the heck? It's my freshman year. I'm undecided. I might do law or business. I may as well volunteer there. The first time I met these chimpanzees, I was hooked. Asked them a question, how are you, what is your name? They responded. I thought I could spend the rest of my life studying these individuals. And so this is Dar, one of her close companions there. There are 3 other chimpanzees that have sanctuary here at this institute in central Washington, in Washington State. And this is where I spent 6 years as an undergraduate and a graduate student. On the weekends, we would talk about conservation projects happening all across equatorial Africa. And this is where I heard about David Morgan. And so, though I became very close to the chimpanzees there, they were more than research subjects. They were actually very close friends. And on graduation day, when I was about to leave, the first people I wanted to see were the great apes that I'd spent so much time with. It was time to go on and try to help chimpanzees in a broader context in Africa. So the way to get out there, I thought, was to write a letter to David Morgan, who is the intrepid explorer in Northern Republic of Congo. There's no regular mail service to Congo, so I sent this letter to the National Geographic photographer that David mentioned, Nick Nichols, and asked if he could please deliver that to David Morgan. And he did. He brought it out to the base camp, and he said, Dave, you wouldn't believe it. You got a piece of mail. We're a graduate student in Washington State, and it's on stationery and everything. She wants to come out and work with you. But he was so busy, he didn't have a chance to answer. So I just continued to stalk him a little bit and contacted his parents in Florida. And when he was back on vacation, he eventually relented and decided to meet with this crazy girl who was stalking him and who wanted to study chimpanzees with him in Republic of Congo, which I think is a pretty good decision. And so our beginnings were pretty basic. It was just the 2 of us. Sometimes we had a tracker or 2 to assist us, but this was basically our camp. A little stick table with some dishes and a campfire, and we'd go out and look for the chimpanzees every day. Some of my fondest memories in Republic of Congo were those early days together. And to orient you to where our study site is located, we've been talking about Congo and Goualougo Triangle and the Mbeli Bai. We are found in Central Africa. You can see the Republic of Congo highlighted here on the map of Africa. Where we are located is in the southern section of the Nuabali and Ndoki National Park, which is in the northern part of the country. The political and economic capitals are in the southern portion of the country. So here we can see the Goualougo highlighted as the red appendix that was hanging to the southern part of the Nuabali and Ndoki National Park. It wasn't actually part of the initial formation of the Nuabali and Ndoki National Park in the early 90s, but rather part of a logging concession. And that's why Dave was invited into the area to do some of the initial surveys of these naive chimpanzees that had never seen humans in hopes of conserving them and protecting them from the inevitable logging that was coming into the area. And we're very, very pleased to be able to report to you that after 13 years of effort, the area was annexed to the Nuabali and Ndoki National Park just in January 2012. The president of the Republic of Congo, Denis Sassou Nguesso, made an announcement to his cabinet of ministers that he, by presidential decree, would make this very unique place part of the protected areas. So these chimpanzees and gorillas that we work with are now safe from logging. Yay! We are also very happy. So here, just to orient you where the Goualougo Triangle is located with regards to other long-term study sites, you can see the different ranges of the subspecies highlighted. So here we have in West Africa the long-term study sites of Boso and Tai that have been going for nearly 30 years. And if we look in the eastern portion of their range, their species range was just highlighted in the different colors, we see the long-term study sites of Gombe, Mahali, Kibali, and Badongo. Gombe, as you know, is the field site of Jane Goodall, and she's been studying there for nearly 60 years. But what's interesting is the range of the central subspecies, Pan-Troglodytes troglodytes and Pan-Troglodytes ellioti, had very little research. And actually at Gashaka, they haven't succeeded in habituating apes to human presence. So we know very little about chimpanzees in this particular region. So David's research at this particular time in our long-term study site was actually needed to understand more about chimpanzees. So what we commonly hold about chimpanzees are from these distant extents of their range in West Africa and East Africa, where actually the largest, most populous regions of chimpanzees are in the central portion of their range, where we're working in the Goualougo Triangle. So to introduce you to some of our applied research and conservation questions, why we're out in the Goualougo Triangle and what we're doing, we're studying the behavioral ecology of chimpanzees and gorillas. and how they live together. We're documenting their abundance and spatial distribution across a large landscape of several hundred square kilometers, as you'll hear about. We're also trying to assess the effects of logging on great apes and also the health threats to them in this region. You'll hear about some emerging infectious diseases such as Ebola hemorrhagic fever, but there have been other diseases in the region as well. And finally, we'll talk about our efforts to involve local people and to strengthen local capacity to be able to carry on the conservation traditions established in this region.
One of the common questions we receive is, how do you get to this very remote site? And from this satellite image here, you can see the Republic of Congo. The capital is Brazzaville in the south of the country. There's around 2 million, just over 2 million people living in Brazzaville. Throughout the countries, there's just around 3.5 million people. Most of the population of humans live in the south. And you can see, indicated by the green, the vast areas of forest in the north of the country. And this is where the apes are, and this is where other aspects of natural resources like timber are located as well. But we get there by flying from Brazzaville on a regional plane to a frontier town called Weso. And that takes about 2.5 hours. And then from Weso, we get into a large tree that's been cut out, a pirogue, and we go up the Sangha River. And that takes about 6.5 hours. It's totally forested along these areas of the river. And we arrive at the park headquarters, which is called Bomassa. At that time, in the early 90s, there was about 400 people living in Bomassa. It's grown a little bit. But the park headquarters is located outside of the national park, and that's really important in terms of conservation. Once we get to Bomassa, it's a combination of using trucks that sometimes break down, quite often break down, and you end up repairing them, spending time sitting on the side of the road. From Bomassa, we pack our bags, and Crickette and I like to kind of joke, we're kind of like the Beverly Hillbillies. We've got our pots and pans strapped to our backpacks there. And we carry all the food, all the necessities we need for the next month, month and a half out to the field site. And it takes about 6.5 hours marching after we leave these small little pirogues after heading to the Ndoki River. And at the Ndoki port, you're at the footsteps of one of the largest parks in Central Africa. The New Mbali Ndoki National Park is just over 5,000 square kilometers of forest. And you can see at the very end of our walk, we end up crossing a small stream where the camp is located. So it takes about, from reaching Brazzaville, it takes about 3.5, 4 days to get out to the field site at that time. Crickette likes to call our camp rustic. We have bashes with screened-in tents that are located underneath them. This is our office tent where we'll have computers, lights. This is our kitchen. This is our wood fireplace, and we run our computers and our lights off of solar panels that we have throughout the camp. We like to have a small footprint, leave a small footprint, so there are no permanent structures at this camp, and there never will be. But we base a lot of our field work and even expeditions out into the national park from this main camp. We spend a lot of time after eating dinner around the campfire, and this is very important to us. As we'll introduce our team and our trackers, they're the backbone of this study, and we spend a lot of time talking about chimps, other wildlife, and it's some of our fondest memories is sitting around that campfire at night. Early on in the beginning of the study, we realized we were going to need to build up a team. As Crickette mentioned, these chimpanzees were naive, so from the very beginning of the study, we could make observations of them using tools in the canopy, socializing. And so we put out ads to recruit local Congolese, and we could see some of the individuals who've turned up at the early part of the study, a ragtag group. And some of these individuals now have been working with us for over 10 years. Some of their children are now working for our project as they've grown up. And this team is fantastic. There's 35 individuals that we work with on a rotating basis. They know a lot about the natural history, the wildlife. They live very close to the wildlife in remote villages, and they're a very important part of our work. It's been a pleasure getting to know some of the individual chimpanzees in the Goualougo Triangle. At this time, we've identified nearly 500 individual chimpanzees in 14 different communities throughout the whole study area. But we focus on several main groups. And in the beginning, we didn't have still cameras or video cameras, and so in order to get individual IDs, we would sketch their faces. Macallan, he's got a large scar on his face. Fiona, she's got white markings on her chin. And that's just an easy way for us to identify individuals. We're also getting to know families. This is Teresa. She's a dominant female in the Moto community, our study main group. She's had 4 offspring. When I first arrived in Goualougo, she was one of the first individuals I observed, and she had a juvenile with her named Louis that we named Louis, and now he's an adult male. He's a high-ranking male in this community. And Teresa is a great mother. She's prolific, as you can see. She's got Leaky, Leaf, and now Riza. She was just born last year, and she's a very important tool user as well. And we're proud to say the newest individual of the Moto community has been named Joda, after the Jungle of the Apes, St. Louis Zoo. We're very proud of the fact that St. Louis Zoo is interested in supporting our work, Stephanie's involvement, and we look forward to providing information on Joda, seen here with her mother, Moja.
So immediately from David's first days in the Goualougo Triangle, he realized that there were some unique aspects of the chimpanzee technology that were to be documented. One example are the types of tools that he found near termite nests. You can see this wooden tool that he's holding. This is actually an implement used by a chimpanzee to dig into a subterranean termite nest. And it's not like a chimpanzee tool you would find at any other long-term study site, even after 60 years at Gombe in East Africa, or 30 years at Tai in West Africa. This is like a dowel that you would buy at a local hardware store. It's smooth, the bark has been removed from the length of it, and it seems to be inserted into the soil. But we hadn't made any direct observations of these apes using these tools, so it was still quite a mystery. And furthermore, in this particular context, we didn't just find those wooden dowel-like tubes shown at the bottom here, those types of tools, but we also found herbaceous tools that looked kind of like paintbrushes, where the ends had been frayed into nice tips that were soft and brush-like. And it seemed like the chimpanzees were doing this intentionally because only one end of the tool was ever frayed. And so we never find something that might be a byproduct of use of both sides of the tools being frayed, or something that could be caused by the environment. It seemed like something unique that chimpanzees were doing that had never been documented at any other long-term study site. So there were tantalizing bits of evidence of things that we could possibly discover that would be new to science, or at least new to chimpanzee science, if you will. So instead of habituating the chimpanzees, which can take several years, during the early years, we put out remote video cameras with passive infrared sensors to give us a little bit of a leg up on observing the chimpanzees. Though they were naive, they certainly didn't like to be followed at close proximity by a bunch of hairless apes with backpacks and tripods, trying to awkwardly get to the forest as much as we tried. It's very difficult to track chimpanzees, and now they're habituated to our presence. But in those early days, we thought we'd cheat a bit by tying these cameras to trees near termite nests and hope that they could do some of the work for us. And we could put out 20 cameras and monitor 20 termite nests 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and be able to track the chimpanzees and try to observe other aspects of their behavior. So this particular clip gives an example of the types of ways that chimpanzees sometimes outsmart us. So we would put up a camera and camouflage it as best we could, but we see the chimp is obviously potentially sitting next to the camera there. She comes up closely. She's obviously aware of the camera, and she will look into the camera lens, and she's even broken off a stick there. So instead of using it at the nice, lovely termite nest behind her, which her daughter has a tool in her mouth, we see that Sarah, this adult female, is more engaged actually with our camera. And when we recovered this particular tool, we were wondering, what kind of tool is this? Is this a tool for a termite nest, or is this a tool specifically for a camera? And she's actually going to modify it in a second to be a more effective implement to jab at our camera and hopefully not break it. But we were surprised to see that adults were as interested as they were in the camera. Sometimes the juveniles are very curious and interested, but here she would spend lots of time making her perfect tool, peering into the lens of the camera. And for an adult female to take time away from foraging, we thought this was quite extraordinary. And she's actually one that will actually greet the cameras every time she sees them at a termite nest. She comes up and looks inside. We're not exactly sure why, but she's certainly very interested. We'll tap on them, trying to get their attention maybe, but she's obviously very interested in the cameras to the point where it takes away from time from her feeding. And her kids are also picking up on this tradition, being very interested. But once she gets used to poking the camera and seeing that it's safe with her tool, she will investigate it with her fingers as well. Smells the tip. Ah, it's not so scary. I think I can touch it now. So she starts to mess with the camera with her hands. But we did eventually get the type of tool behavior that we were looking for. And so here we're going to see termite fishing with that brush tip tool by Griffin. And so you can see he opens the surface of the nest with his fingers, straightens that brush very quickly, and inserts it into the nest. That brush can be somewhat unruly, so sometimes you have to straighten it just like that to get it inserted into the nest, straighten it again, and insert it into the tunnels that the termites have made to exit the nest. So that's pretty standard termite fishing, but just with a brush tip modification. It actually improves their efficiency. Here we're going to see Teresa use a twig tool to open the surface of the nest. This has very rarely been observed at any other long-term sites. At Gombe, over 60 years, they've never observed it. So here in Goualougo, we were very excited to make the first video recorded documentation of 2 types of tools used in one task. So she opened up the surface of the nest and then threads in her fishing probe with the brush tip tool. And then a completely new discovery to science was how they use those wooden dowel-like tools. So there she is with her long wooden tool. This is Rosetta, inserting it into the ground using her foot for leverage to actually make a tunnel into a subterranean nest. There's no tunnel there. She's using her body weight to create a tunnel so that she can thread in a fishing probe to extract the nest, as her juvenile's doing. She needs another tool. She needs that brush tip tool, so she tries to steal it from her youngster, which isn't the nicest thing to do, but you can see her little juvenile there, oh, try to take the tool, not so successful, goes over to her older offspring, her son there, and takes away the tool that he's actively using. Because you need 2 tools to accomplish this task, and it simply wouldn't do to use the wooden tool. So she extracts the wooden tool, checks it, smells it to see that she's actually gotten into a termite nest and threads in her fishing tool. But here comes her older child back again, whimpering a bit to beg for the tool because he would like to continue fishing. He had a particularly successful little nest over here, so he gets his tool back. So she steals the tool from her baby. We do see a lot of wonderful interaction with regards to social learning, where infants spend a lot of time in close proximity to their mothers, and the mothers actually share the tools with their offspring rather than steal them from them. This is just one exception of a clip in the other direction. We also see tool use in honey gathering. So here we have an individual. This is footage that had never been recorded anywhere across Africa of a chimpanzee using a large wooden club. Sometimes they can be up to 1 kilogram heavy to pound open a beehive. In this case, it's a dead tree that actually is swaying back and forth and quite dangerous for her to be pounding so diligently because it could actually fall down. But she's trying to access stingless bee honey that's in there. And you can see her little offspring is a little bit further down and experimenting with some types of tools. Not exactly an efficient pounding tool, but a tool that might someday be used for honey dipping, or at least trying to acquire the right use of tools in the right setting. Seeing mother maybe above in the tree, learning how to use tools. Here's mom with another tool. She actually used 7 different tools in this particular instance because honey is a sweet reward. They seem to spend a lot of energy and will also go to great risk to themselves and their offspring to gather this, even though it doesn't provide a huge nutritional return. It's very high in sugar, but not something that you think of with regards to having a lot of protein or even having a huge amount of caloric return, just because it's a very small quantity that you actually get from these particular hives. But you can see she's actually breaking apart the tree that she's standing on, trying to use that to open up the beehive. Tosses away another tool to take this larger piece of bark, and so she comes around to the other side of the tree to try to access this honey. We've seen individuals spend several hours trying to access honey and actually show over 1,000 actions to open the nest. And they're only successful about half of the time. So it's a huge amount of energy for this particular type of food resource, but something very popular. And the local trackers that we work with that David mentioned also gather honey for local traditions, and will use this in their negotiations to purchase their brides. And so usually we have a group of trackers under the tree that are cheering on the chimps, saying, go, you can do it, get that honey, and trying to estimate what quality of honey they're getting from these particular hives. And you can see she has another smaller tool that she'll use to dip into the hive to access the honey. And this is a type of behavior that had never been seen in any other part of Africa. Overall, we documented over 20 different types of tool behaviors, which is an extraordinary amount for wild chimpanzees. In Gombe, as I mentioned, where Jane Goodall works, they've only seen 20 different types of tools. So after just 13 years, we're approaching those same numbers. And we expect to document other types of tool use. We've seen fluid dipping for honey and for water, using rain covers to protect themselves during storms, the 3 different types of tool use in termite fishing that I mentioned, and also the honey pounding and dipping. We've also seen leaf sponging and ant dipping and other types of tool use. And as I mentioned, we expect some others in the future.
So what is the extent of the central chimpanzee and western lowland gorilla? This map here is to show you where they overlap. These areas in Central Africa, particularly in Gabon and Northern Republic of Congo and Cameroon, extensive overlap between these 2 species of great ape. And there's high densities of both chimps and gorillas in these forests, but they're spread out in different ways. There are a variety of different habitats. Where we work in Ndoki, there's a monodominant type of forest. It's the only evergreen forest in that region. There's also a semi-deciduous mixed species forest. Chimps and gorillas love this habitat. Gorillas love the inundated swamp forests. And gorillas also love these Marantaceae forests, so there's a lot of thick undergrowth and not too much canopy. So we find gorillas quite often building nests in these areas. This is a satellite image of Northern Republic of Congo. You can see our study site highlighted in yellow, the 5 different zones in the Goualougo National Park. And from this classified image, we can identify different habitat types. There's 17 different types of habitat in this region. And using that information and our information from our studies of their behavior, nesting, and foraging, we can start to get an idea of where we might predict to find these animals throughout the area, not just in national parks. And this here is our first results from some of our suitable ape habitat modeling that we've done. The image on our left here shows the study site, the 5 study zones in Goualougo National Park, and the logging concessions bordering the national park. The areas in light yellow and dark red, that's where we predict to find gorillas based on their habitat use, based on their nesting behavior. And we can see, compared to chimpanzees, which are located on the right here, they use very different habitats. In our studies of transects, where we count chimps and gorillas on net by using their nests, we find that our estimates are spot on in terms of Goualougo being very good for chimpanzees, and outside in the logged forest, more open canopy, better habitat for gorillas. And if we think about where we might find both chimps and gorillas, because we remember we're very interested in conservation, and with very few dollars to help protect species, we often try to think of, okay, where are we going to have our best chance at saving both chimps and gorillas? And we can see in these areas, particularly with the Goualougo National Park, we've done a good job of protecting chimps and gorillas, apes in general, by making this protected area. But there's a lot of areas outside of the national park that are good habitat for gorillas and chimpanzees. And as we know, these forests are changing dramatically right now. One of our current adventures right now is habituating gorillas, a group of western lowland gorillas in the study community where we're working with the chimpanzees. And this is very important because there's little knowledge on western lowland gorillas, particularly their social behavior and their ecology. These type of focused studies where you can follow the animals, you can see them interact. There's 2 youngsters followed by their father there, the silverback. It's really important. It takes about 2.5 years to habituate a group of gorillas. But once we've done that, and we can see how these individuals overlap in these forests, we think we'll be able to better conserve them. We're finding that chimps and gorillas spend quite a lot of time together instead of separated, as many researchers had suggested. It's interesting here with this footage here, these 2 youngsters, they idolize their father. His name is Kingo. And once he gets up here, you're going to see these guys follow right behind him. And when you walk through the forest with them, you can see how important it is to have their role model, their father, protecting them and following along. As we mentioned, there are certain threats facing gorillas and chimpanzees. Predominantly right now, mechanized logging is threatening their existence. Also, the bushmeat trade is pervasive through these forests. and also disease. Central Africa is known as a hotspot for the emergence of disease. And all of these are interrelated in many different ways, and that's part of our work, is trying to study how they are impacting each other. We know that with mechanized logging and the influx of humans into these remote forests, they can bring parasites that can be very detrimental to chimps and gorillas. We also know people are at great risk from Ebola that we've shown has been documented by picking up carcasses of dead apes that have been affected and died from Ebola. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of understanding these threats, how they're related, and how to protect apes and local human populations. The logging in northern Congo is very selective. They'll take around 20 different species of trees, but there's only 3 main species of tree that they cut at this time. And they're not really important to chimps per se for logging or for foraging or nesting. But you can see from this image, the roads that are built are very destructive. They clear out the environment. But overall, they removed 1 to 3 trees per square hectare in these forests, which isn't a lot compared to, say, mechanized logging in Asia, where they clear cut, and in some areas of South America. So this has important implications for conservation. This map here is to show you where the active logging is taking place in Central Africa. The areas in brown, these are the active logging concessions that are exploited for timber on an average of every 20 to 30 years. The areas in green, those are protected areas, national parks where logging can't take place. But you can see logging is taking place throughout most of this region that is completely forested. We work in the northern part, and the concessions located around the New Valendoki National Park is an area where the logging company practices FSC, Forest Stewardship Council certified logging. We're very fortunate. Only 4% of these active logging concessions are under FSC certified forestry. So what are the impacts that we're seeing, and how do we study that on the great apes? Here you can see some of these mahogany trees that have been left on the side of the road. On average, these trees are about 500 to 900 years old. So in terms of sustainability, it's really not sustainable logging in that sense. But we can work with the foresters to better protect the apes. One way we do that is by studying how the apes move in relation to logging and how they're impacted, their habitat is impacted. This area here is 2 different time periods of the same area. This is 2004, and with this satellite imagery, we've also combined the behavioral monitoring of chimps and gorillas to show you where the best habitat for both of these species is in this area. The area in green is their best habitat, and areas in red, it's not very good, and there's low food availability in those areas. In 2008, at the height of logging taking place in these forests, we see a dramatic decrease in the amount of good habitat available to chimps and gorillas in that forest. And that's because of the logging company has moved in and pushed the apes out of those areas. Fortunately, though, and as we'll show, chimps and gorillas were able to survive this impact. We can take that very specialized, localized data on chimps and gorillas and logging and work with other scientists who are working throughout the continent of Africa. The map here shows you kind of the range of habitat where gorillas and chimps can be found. And we've collaborated with individuals in Germany to assess chimps and gorillas and the availability of habitat and how it's declined from 1990 to 2000. And based on our estimates of nesting behavior of the apes and also environmental variables and human population growth estimates for these regions, we're seeing dramatic decreases in the availability of good habitat for chimps and gorillas, particularly in the Cameroonian area and also in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Some areas, up to 60% of their habitat has declined since 1990. Along with that, you might not be able to assess the effect of bushmeat, which is hunting is taking place throughout most of this region. And that's because the expansion of logging roads into these areas means that people can get rides, they can use motorized pirogues on these navigable rivers, and the exploitation of dikers and other hoofstock is really important right now, and the declines are dramatic. Unless you have eco-guards working out in these forests, protecting these animals, hunting is really dramatic. And what we've done in that area just outside of the Goualougo Triangle, we've tried to map that out and assess that in terms of encounter rates. When we looked at 2004 in this area to look at the encounter rates of chimps and gorillas in the area, well, apes, they dominated that forest. Encounter rates of gorillas and chimps up to nearly 6 encounters per kilometer, whereas humans, we very infrequently saw in that area. From 2006 all the way to 2010, we re-walked these transects, these 89 kilometers of transects. And what we saw is when the trees were being removed, we saw a dramatic increase in human presence in that forest, which isn't totally unexpected because of the loggers were moving throughout that area, but there was also poaching going on in those forests. Despite all of that, our encounter rates for chimps and gorillas over that time period, when there's dramatic disturbance going on, they fluctuated, but the apes were able to maintain a normal baseline level of around 1.8 chimps per square kilometer and just at 2 gorillas per square kilometer. So that's very good, because even after the timber company had moved out of the area, the encounter rates stayed relatively normal for the chimps and gorillas. While human signs decreased, we're still finding signs of humans in there, poachers in that area. So that kind of information we pass on to the forestry, the ministry, and they send eco-guards in there to help protect these species. We're particularly concerned about the changes in health risks to chimps and gorillas. Working with scientists at Emory University, we're looking at the parasite loads, not only in the environment where the chimps and gorillas live, but also inside them by checking their feces for parasite loads. And what we found is when mechanized logging moves into an area, humans come into the area and they introduce these very dangerous parasites, such as Strongyloides stercoralis, which we found in 25% of our vegetation plots out in the logging concession. In our study zone, where we practice protocols and safety measures, we didn't find any Strongyloides stercoralis in the environment, nor did we find it in the chimps and the gorillas' feces. 8% of the gorillas in this region of the logging area have Strongyloides stercoralis in them. We're not exactly sure how it will impact them, but we know for humans in compromised deficiencies, it can be very detrimental to them. We work with our teams, of course, on these studies to educate them about these changes that are happening and how to prevent them. Working with the logging company, we can use this information to help change their ways as well, their forestry practices. Crickette and I published this document in 2007, and we're coming out with a revised one because based on our new information. And because this is an FSC-certified concession, the logging company has to accept this information, and we work with them to try to ameliorate the considerations, particularly with health.
As David mentioned and already talked a little bit about, one of the main conservation threats that we're very concerned about is disease to the great apes. And one that is right on our doorstep, if you will, is that of Ebola hemorrhagic fever. And you can see, looking at this map, where the recent outbreaks have been in relation to the Goualougo Triangle. So this is the Odzala-Kukwa National Park. It's about 200 kilometers from the region where we work in Northern Republic of Congo. So the red triangles indicate the recent outbreaks near the Odzala region and across the border in Gabon. And you can see in the Nuabalindoki National Park, the area of the Goualougo Triangle, we haven't seen any outbreaks, but we're constantly vigilant and also trying to work with individuals in Odzala to better understand the natural history of the virus and how it's transmitted from its natural reservoir in bat species, frugivorous bat species, possibly to gorillas or chimpanzees or both, how this is transmitted between these two species or between some amplifying vector like a Red River forest hog and into the environment, and then infects human populations as they go into the forest. They find ape carcasses already infected by Ebola, and they scavenge them, take them back to the village and butcher them, and this is how it's introduced into local communities. So it's a huge human health concern in this region and not very well understood with regards to the natural history in the forest. So we're using our modeling of different habitats to try to understand where Ebola emerges and how to pinpoint those localities so that interventions could possibly be made, also just to understand more about the natural history of the virus. So here we see in grayscale the habitat quality simulations that we've produced in the Odzala region. So dark areas are better habitat quality, lighter regions are less quality habitat. And we try to simulate how an Ebola spread would occur within that environment. So blue being around the emergence of the Ebola outbreak, and then red being as it spreads. And we try to map this against existing data to see what the most likely scenarios are. So we've done 6 million simulations of these outbreak spreads to see what the most likely scenario is. And we've come up with just a handful of statistically significant results that can help us pinpoint that virus. So this is one way that we can intervene. We also monitor communities very carefully for mortality events because we want to be the first ones to detect an Ebola epidemic if it occurs within our study groups. And so every single mortality event is taken very seriously. We try to collect diagnostic samples. So you'll see here, this is an actual mortality event where Caroline, an adult female in our community, was found to be deceased, and her baby actually hadn't died but was clinging to her chest. We wanted to sample Caroline's carcass to determine through diagnostic samples if she had passed away from Ebola or if this was some other cause, to try to determine what had caused her death. So we waited for a day, the baby disappeared at night, and we were able to sample the carcass. We're trained to non-invasively collect tissue samples from carcasses to be sent to Gabon for diagnostic testing for Ebola and other pathogens like anthrax. So here I am sampling the carcass there with our staff watching on. But we also set up remote video cameras to see if we can try to determine what the cause of death might be. We have a pretty likely suspect that showed up the next day. So this individual actually picked up Caroline's body from this location and stored it in the vegetation behind, but then rolled around on the ground. And you can see that very large belly that actually probably contains a large portion of this poor female in our Moto community. And also we found from remote video footage that the leopard had killed her baby during the night when we were gone. So this, in this particular situation, was probably not an Ebola hemorrhagic fever outbreak we've determined from the tissue samples, but likely to be predated upon by this particular leopard individual, who then comes back days later and just picks up the remains of her carcass and carries them off to cache them again. So there are natural occurrences of mortality, and we're trying to differentiate those from emerging infectious diseases. But also, we want to study how infection moves across the environment, as I mentioned, between particular species. So we're looking at how chimps and gorillas interact at particular fruiting resources. We found a huge amount of overlap, as David mentioned, more than we ever expected between chimps and gorillas. They spend, on average, about 47 minutes together at these resources, so there's ample opportunity for them to pass diseases between one another. And there's usually, on average, 10 chimps and about 4 gorillas at these contexts. So the trees are swaying back and forth with apes. You just imagine all those hundreds of apes pounds in those canopies of those trees. But a perfect intersection for disease transmission. We also found some unique information with regards to their foraging patterns. It's pretty obvious that chimps forage during the daytime. We think of them as diurnal apes, but we were surprised to put up cameras at night and to find video footage of chimpanzees foraging in the canopy at night more often than they did during the day at the same tree. That really surprised us, to find chimps being nocturnal foragers, spending a lot of time between 2 and 6 a.m. in the morning. We also found similar results with gorillas. So here's a gorilla group that's visiting a fruiting tree underneath the canopy. We see a silverback. You can see his eye shine from the passive infrared light sensor that's being emitted from this camera. He picks up a fruiting tree that's a fruit that's dropped from the canopy of this fruiting tree and is feeding on it while looking at the camera, probably seeing the infrared glow there. But you'll see another individual come up, a youngster in his group. So this was actually a group that was foraging at night, and that's quite dangerous when we think about that leopard that's on the prowl, looking also for a meal at nighttime. So here comes a youngster, a bit hesitant, seeing the shine of the camera, and is going to approach the fruit and pick up a fruit, and not so bold as to be in front of the camera to feed on it, but will actually carry it away to a secure location. But we were surprised to see this type of nocturnal feeding behavior by the great apes. We had not expected that to be so frequent, and probably could also be a factor with regards to how they avoid competition with elephants, which are quite abundant in this forest as well, and feeding during the daytimes at these trees and attracted to the fruiting resources. So maybe this is a mechanism of how they avoid competition. So you can see this little cutie picks up the fruit and just decides to carry it off camera to consume it. so we can't see, but obviously a group foraging there at night as well. We try to have a very proactive health program to protect the apes, and we're working with a number of sites. So on this map, you can see where we are in Goualougo. There's also a star for Mbeli Bai, another star for Mandika field site where gorillas are habituated to human presence, and then also in Baihuku in Central African Republic. And we're working with all of these sites to coordinate how we observe apes and their health so that we can look for the emergence of diseases across a larger landscape, and also to implement preventative measures like wearing face masks when you're observing individuals like this silverback kingo, and also being able to train our teams to collect diagnostic specimens when necessary and a mortality event occurs. Another conservation threat, which David didn't mention, but we feel is very important to mention that we're actively involved in, is the lack of opportunity or training for local Congolese people. And so here we see pictures of one of our staff members in the Republic of Congo working, Crickette Ayana. The top pictures of him working in Northern Republic of Congo, conducting transects and direct observations of great apes. The bottom pictures are from his recent trip to America in January to June this year. And he went to Central Washington University, where I had the opportunity to work with Washoe and the signing chimps. He actually got to meet the chimps and intern at that lab, and has a whole new appreciation for chimpanzees. He can't believe they read magazines and wear clothes and jewelry and all these things. He couldn't wait to go back and tell all the trackers that we work with the story of the chimpanzees in America. But he also learned many skills, including English and how to conduct behavioral monitoring using handheld computers, which I'll talk about in a moment. We also try to have an impact on local schools. So we've worked with 1 laptop per child to introduce laptops to the local grade school, and have built a local library to increase educational opportunities for kids and get them excited about conservation. And we are so fortunate to be able to partner with the St. Louis Zoo, Stephanie Bercini and her staff. They have helped us to pilot the use of these handheld computers to collect behavioral data. And literally, we took the same computers and configurations that we used in Forest Park straight to the Ndoki Forest to collect behavioral data on the great apes. And this really helps us to hone our research methods. And it's important to have comparative data with captive populations as well. So we appreciate their ongoing support, and also the chance to let us interact with apes away from our home in Congo, because we get to the point where we're missing them very much, and it's nice to be here and spend time with the gorillas, chimps, and orangs at the St. Louis Zoo. So really, the truth about chimps to us is that there's so much more to learn and so many different discoveries to be made. And we feel that there are many more things that will come from the Goualougo Triangle, and we appreciate your coming here tonight to hear some of the first preview of these. And we thank the St. Louis Zoo for the invitation, particularly Stephanie Bercini and Ingrid Portone, the curator of primates, for all of their support over the years. And if you're interested in learning more about the project, we have a website at www.congoapes.org. Thanks so much.
We're happy to take any questions that you might have. The question is, do the leopards hunt chimpanzees that are alive, or do they just forage on carcasses? And we have anecdotal observations of leopards going up into the canopy, 40 meters up. We've gone to contacts where we've heard chimps screaming and come and seen this leopard up in the canopy with a female and her infant at the side of the tree getting ready to leap out because the leopard was getting ready to attack her. And the leopard, once it saw us, came back down and ran off. But those type of observations and the observations by other scientists where they've observed gorillas being chased by leopards and individuals being attacked suggest that leopards, they'll even go after adult male silverbacks.
And we've even felt nervous when we were sampling some of those carcasses with the leopards prowling around. They're pretty bold when they're not nervous for hunting or any other reasons. That's a great question. Yep.
We do see when we're with the apes, the chimpanzees, they'll stand up and they'll scan the environment quite a lot. And when they're termite fishing, they'll stand up quite often and look back. Now, they could be responding to other chimps in the area, but they do spend quite a lot of time scanning the forest in front of them and standing up, sometimes climbing up a little bit to the middle story to get a view, because leopards can be basically anywhere in those forests waiting to pounce on them.
That's a very good question. There could be several reasons. One could be the competition with gorillas. So they need to have different food resources and diversify into foods that they're not directly competing with gorillas on. It could be also that we have an abundance of different types of insect species. We haven't done all the comparisons necessary to see if we have more different species of termites than other sites, or ants or bees. This could also play a factor, so ecological opportunities. The other thing I think that is important is the strong social networks within the communities. So we have a relatively high abundance of chimps, and they seem to have cohesive social networks. So once a tradition is innovated, it can spread across different individuals relatively effectively. So these are the main hypotheses that we're working with. But that's a great question. I can't answer that definitively as of yet. Very good question.
We have not really seen that type of aggression in the Goualougo with the chimpanzees. Now, chimpanzees are territorial. We do have group interactions. At night, we'll hear, and sometimes during the day, two communities neighboring each other, communicating, calling at night, vocalizing back and forth, and sometimes during the day. We do see boundary patrols, where the males will go off in a line. They'll head towards the other community. We see that on our chimp cam. Chimps coming in and checking the tool sites and smelling the tools from the other community. So they are territorial, but we haven't seen the elevated levels of aggression that they've seen at some of these other sites. It may be that there's differences in food resources, differences in densities of chimps. These chimps haven't been impacted by humans, like in those other areas as well. So several factors, but also we haven't focused that much on that type of research as well.
Good question. Yes.
For the concessions that are around us, they're FSC certified, they have to follow specific guidelines. They're kind of general, and it's up to the country to develop them further, and scientists to help them. But they don't do any replanting of these forests, but it is very selective. So they're only removing 1 to 3 trees per hectare. And so that's a low stem density that they're removing. So it's not as destructive in a sense. And these concessions are also very remote. And so once they've logged that area, then they come back 30 years later, there's a chance for some regrowth, not those same species, but of trees to come back. So we're very hopeful that this logging, FSC certified logging, will spread throughout these other concessions, because we think it is a benefit compared to other concessions that don't practice FSC certified logging, because they probably have much more of a destructive impact on the forest.
But that is a really good question. When we go into these different logging companies' concessions, I was quite surprised to be walking through the forest and see all the trees with big paint splotches on them. So a big paint splotch would mean this tree is fine, leave it alone, we won't be logging it this time, but maybe next time around. Whereas a red X would mean this tree is coming out this time. So those trees with the big red X's weren't that common, but there is a lot of collateral damage when they take those out. They have to take in skidder trucks to be able to pull them out after they've been cut and so on. So you do see a lot of damage to those trees, even that they didn't mean to take out, that might be for the next rotation. But a lot of the forest is left standing, albeit disturbed forest. It's a very good question. Yep. So we see the chimpanzees communicate with postures, facial expressions. We also see gestures occasionally, and a lot of vocalizations. Vocalizations both in close proximity and also long-range vocalizations, like pant hoots to announce, hey guys, I got a big fruiting tree, or there's crazy humans here with all their tripods again. come take a look, and then that'll actually bring other chimpanzees in. But a lot of the typical types of things you would see with communicative behavior of great apes. Good question.
We have adopted, by speaking with other individuals about the way they've habituated gorillas, their methods in terms of approaching the gorillas, habituating certain individuals at that time. For example, not staring at them directly. Our postures have a lot to do with it. We've sent our trackers to other field sites that have been successful in habituating gorillas to learn from them, because it's very dangerous. Once the silverback starts to become kind of accustomed to you, they become very aggressive. They start to charge. They come and they try to grab you. The silverbacks do. And it's about a 6 or 7 month period where you have to have a good team that are confident and know what to do with different behaviors from the animal.
But right away when we were trying to habituate the gorillas, they charge up because they're very nervous and they're defending their family group, so the silverback will charge right up. And one of the things that we've taken from the work of Diane Fossey is that you pretend like you're eating. And so we would do that. David and I would do that. Big gorilla, 400 pounds, comes charging out of nowhere to confront you, and you act like you're eating some leaves. And our trackers who worked with us are like, "Are these guys crazy? They're not eating leaves. They never do that." But so then the next time the gorillas charge, all the trackers start doing that too. So we look like a group of foraging primates, and we start to do it more frantically as the gorilla gets more aggressive to try to be more convincing to him. And I don't think he buys it at all. He's smarter than that, but it is something we try to do. It's a good question.
The team buys into it. They're like, "Oh, eat! Everybody eat!"
Everybody eat those leaves.
Silverback coming in repeatedly
That's gonna calm
is
him
very
down.
nerve-wracking.
I don't know if we're fooling anybody. We look silly though. That's a very good question. We have absolutely had chimps break the camera with their sticks. They've broken the little lenses, but the worst people that break the cameras the most are termites. They actually go into the seals of the area where it's supposed to be watertight and eat the little spongy seals, get inside, eat the cameras up in the tapes. So the termites are the worst. So placing cameras at termite nests is pretty dangerous, actually. It's a good question.
It's quite clear the silverback, when he's in a tree with the chimps and the rest of his group, he feeds where he wants to. And all the other individuals, they monitor him. And when he starts to move, they adjust to where they're feeding. And there's differences in the tree where there's good fruit and bad fruit at that time. But other than that, the chimps and the gorillas, when they're co-feeding, they seem to just ignore each other and feed. And these large trees, you can have, as Crickette mentioned, a lot of apes up in the canopy. We've seen some of our first evidence of aggression when a silverback came up just recently into a tree. The BBC filmed it for a documentary that will be coming up out this Christmas on Discovery. The silverback comes up the tree. There's a very finite amount of fruit left in the canopy, and he goes right directly towards it, and the 3 chimps that are feeding there get out of his way. So they were displaced in that case. But typically on the ground or in the canopy, they seem to ignore each other.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And go Cardinals!
Woo, yeah, go Cards!